Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development CropTalk webinar series. If you have any questions during the presentations today, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to the June 3rd edition of CropTalk. And today on CropTalk, we have John Gavlosky with us, and he's going to give us, I guess, an insect and ID and scouting update for this year. We're getting into that time where a lot of the crop is coming through the ground, especially a lot of the canola is coming up, and I think a lot of scouting has been going on regarding some of the issues that might pop up. So I thought it'd be a good time for John to give us a refresher and maybe talk about some of the things that he's been seeing happening in the field so far this year. Then from there, we'll go on to our crop scouting panel. We have, again, got some good questions that have happened over the past week, and so things that I think people are seeing out in the field that will help answer. Before we get too far involved, I'll just do a quick update today. We have a fair bit of stuff to go through, so my update is going to be short this morning. Basically, still a few producers out there that are actually doing some combining. I seen one combine going yesterday for sure, and so there's still producers taking off the 2019 crop. Warm weather plus really strong winds over the last week let producers make some good progress in seeding. I think on average for the province, we're sitting right around 88% complete. There are definitely some pockets that received large amounts of rainfall or were really wet from last spring or last fall, I should say, that are still, maybe in that 50 to 60%, but as a province, we're around 88% complete. Down from last year, and our 3-year average, it would be about 94% right now. And I think the big push is on this week as we are getting closer to some deadlines for crop insurance for getting the crop in the ground. And just something interesting that's on our website, I thought I would show. It's maximum wind speeds, and this was for May the 27th when we were getting some pretty good strong winds, and we had areas, 60 to 70 kilometers, some areas in over 80 kilometers. So definitely wind has been a factor, and it's something that's we're going to deal with here for the next little while. With these strong winds, one of the biggest concerns I'm hearing from producers right now is they're falling behind on spraying. Both the burn-offs as well as in-crop spraying is starting in some areas already, because some of the crop is getting into some of the cereal crops are getting into that 3 to 4 leaf stage already in some areas, lots in that 2 to 3 leaf stage. So producers are going to be wanting to get some of this crop sprayed. And then just with the burn-offs in general, I think there's a lot of crop that's emerged, so it's drift is definitely another factor that a lot of producers are watching. Last week we received some frost, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later in the webinar today, but there were several areas that received some good frost, and maybe even in the eastern to interlake areas seem to have more of the damage throughout the province. Some of their weather stations are reporting -2 to -3 for up to 6 hours. Been hearing of some reseeding starting in some of those areas. A lot of the areas in the southern side of the province, or southwestern side of the province here, a lot of the canola was just starting to poke through the ground. So even though there were some areas that received some cooler temperatures, we didn't see a whole lot of damage. And we're going to be I guess talking a little bit about that later on in the presentation here. So with that, that'll be my brief update, and let's turn it over to John, and John will go through our insect update.
Okay, thank you, Lionel. So what we're going to go over today is a early season insect update. I'm going to focus on both ID and scouting for insects, and we're going to cover 5 different insects today, or insect groups. flea beetles and cutworms, couple insect groups that are currently quite active and doing some damage in some areas. We'll go over grasshoppers a bit, diamondback moth, and I'm going to cover a weevil that we've noticed recently in western Manitoba, and more of an update for people just to get them watching for this and hopefully reporting anything they do see. And I hope you have a pencil or pen and some paper with you during this. There is going to be a quiz as well. I've got 7 questions, 4 of them on insect ID and 3 on monitoring. So we'll see how well you do on that as well. So we'll start with cutworms. And cutworms are one of the insects that are really not easy to scout for. They can be tricky because they feed at night and they hide during the day. So all you see is their damage when you're walking the fields. But in order to make a spray decision, you really do need to look around and try to find the cutworms. And it's good if you do know a little bit about the species you're dealing with, as well as the staging of them. Those are both important things to consider in making your decisions. One of the ways you can do it is look around some of the damaged plants, use a trowel or a shovel and dig around those damaged plants. You can put the soil through a sieve to try to sieve them out. That doesn't always work though, depending on the soil type. One thing I sometimes do is take a tray out with me. It's a little like a camping tray, and I just put the soil on that and I move the soil around. If you smooth it out enough, you can see the cutworms on there. So different ways you can do it. The important thing is do a little bit digging around and try to get some idea of roughly what the populations are like in the field. So on to the first of our quiz questions here on the ID part. There's actually several species of cutworms that can be present in your fields in Manitoba. They don't all feed the same and their life cycles are a little different, so it's good to know some of the more common ones. So the first one here, one of the things that's diagnostic about it is if you look on the back, it almost looks like they've got tire tracks going down the back, the series of V's going down the back, kind of a dingy color to them. So this one here is dingy cutworm. And the eggs for this species get laid usually in August or September. They overwinter as partially grown larvae. So they're larvae ready to feed as your crop is coming up. They're there quite early. One thing that's characteristic about them in their feeding style, they don't do a lot of cutting. So if you're seeing a lot of clipped plants on the soil, it's probably not dingy cutworm. It's probably something like red-backed or dark-sided. Dingy cutworm will defoliate, but they rarely do a lot of cutting. So you will see chewing on the plants, maybe patches developing, and just no insects present when you're scouting during the day. So you do have to dig around for them. Okay, so the next species here that we'll look at, so this one here has a couple red lines that go down the back of this insect. So they've got a red back to them. And this one here is one of our clippers. It does a lot of clipping. What I'm showing you in the picture here are some of the more developed stages. So these would be getting close to turning into pupa when they get to be this size. This is the redback cutworm, and this one does overwinter as eggs. So they're still in the smaller stages in the soil right now. So they've got a little ways to go yet. They will do clipping, so you will see plants lying on the ground, especially when they get into their older stages. Both dingy and redback cutworm do come above ground to feed, though. So for trying to control them, foliar insecticides can work quite well. So just a few things to watch for when you're scouting for cutworms. First of all, they can be patchy in a field. So, and sometimes they can be very patchy depending on what the situation was like when the eggs were being laid the previous late summer. We've seen fields where there was a weedy patch or a late flowering patch of crops, and the next year that's the cutworm patch. Things like that can happen. So good to scout thoroughly. Sometimes you can get away with patch spraying. You don't have to do the whole field, saves you a bit of money. As far as where to find them, cutworms will go down to usually where the moisture line is in the soil. So if the soil is quite dry, they go deeper when they're hiding out during the day. If you've got some debris underneath on top of the soil and it's nice and moist, they may hang around there. If they're going into the soil, they like it where there's a little bit of moisture, so they will go deeper in the drier soils. So if the soil's quite dry, you might have to dig a little deeper to find them. And as far as controls go, there's 7 active ingredients of insecticides registered in field crops, belonging to 3 different groups of chemicals. What I have as blue on the slide, these are seed treatments. So in canola, you've got Lumiderm or Fortenza Advanced as options as seed treatments. In corn, there's Fortenza. And new this year, actually, is Lumavia CPL. CPL, cereals, pulses, and I believe lentils is CL. This is registered in your small grains, pulse crops like peas, dry beans, saba beans, lentils. So these are seed treatments. If you, based on, I guess, historical findings in a certain area or field, feel that cutworms are a threat the next year, this is certainly an option. The tricky part is cutworms do move around from year to year, and it really is hard to predict where they're going to show up. But we do have these seed treatment options available. As far as foliar sprays go, again, 3 groups. You've got Coragen, quite long residual. It's semi-selective, meaning it kills Lepidoptera, so caterpillars get killed really well. Grasshoppers get killed really well. Beetles, it depends on the type of beetle, but Coragen is pretty much harmless to bees, wasps, parasitic wasps, things like that. So that's one of its, I guess, features that makes it a good choice at times. It is a bit more expensive, though, than some of the other options. The pyrethroids are a bit cheaper. That includes your Matador, your Decis, your Ambush Pounce. Decent residual. Don't spray if it's too hot with these products. So today we're supposed to hit 30 in some parts of Manitoba. Wouldn't be good to be spraying when it's that hot with the pyrethroid. Although with cutworms, we highly recommend spray as late in the day as possible regardless. So again, patch spray if it's an option for you. And again, cutworms are in the ground during the day, up at night, so spraying as late as you can is always a good strategy. As far as what might be eating the cutworms in your soil, there's several things that could be helping out somewhat. Probably one of the biggest predators is ground beetles, and there's lots of different types of ground beetles. We've got about 350 species of them in Manitoba, so they can be black, brown, or like this Calisoma one here, black with some red dots on it. They will easily eat several cutworms per day per individual, so if there's a lot of them in your fields, that's a good thing. This one here was actually a lab pet last year called Peter, and we were feeding it cutworms and grubs, and it would easily devour several per day on us, so hard to keep this little guy fed. There's also parasites that'll be flying around looking to lay eggs into cutworms, things like bee flies, tachinid flies, and parasitic wasps. They can help out. Fungal pathogens can help take the populations down, but they work better in damp, more humid conditions. So we've had some very dry summers and springs for the last few years, which probably has prevented some of these fungal pathogens from really taking off and taking the levels down. Okay, another ID question here, and I've had a few people send me photos like this already this spring. They were finding small white worm-like things, usually anywhere 5 to 10 millimeters, not too long, kind of thin, sometimes occur in bunches. These are called potworms or enchytrid worms. Enchytridae is the family of them. They feed on decaying plant material, and we think they're a large part of what they're feeding on is probably the fungus and bacteria that's growing on the decaying plant material. Essentially, they're a decomposer, so they're good. And usually you do find these where there's a lot of trash and stubble and organic matter in the soil. They're helping break that down, so they're good. They're not going to feed on your crop. So if you do find a lot of these in a field while you're poking around and looking at the seeds and germination, don't worry. They're a good thing. So we'll move on and talk about flea beetles next. Lots of questions on flea beetles this year, and populations once again are quite high. We've had chronically high levels for quite a while. Just a little briefing on flea beetles. We do have different types. In fact, you can find up to 10 different species feeding on crops like canola and mustard in Manitoba. Although odds are most of what you find will be either striped flea beetle, that's the one on your left with the 2 yellow stripes, and crucifer flea beetle, solid black, that's the one on your right. They are a little bit different in their biology. The striped flea beetle comes out a bit earlier. It is a bit more active under cooler conditions. So early in the spring, they normally are more dominant species. When the weather warms up, when we get into June, usually by then the crucifer flea beetle has become a bit more dominant in the population. But they both can be serious problems. Aside from their feeding on the cotyledons and the pitting, they at times will feed on stems. Now, Lionel mentioned about it being quite windy for the last few days. When it's very windy out, they're not as active on the cotyledons. They will sometimes be feeding more on stems. They will sometimes be in the cracks in the soil and just not surfacing as much when it's windy. When you will see them out on the plants more is on hot, calm, dry days. That's their favorite feeding conditions. Now, we're still trying to find out more about what makes them do a lot of stem feeding and how they respond to windy conditions. So what I'm telling you is actually a bit anecdotal right now based on observation. That research is being done at the University of Manitoba right now, and they're trying to figure out just what causes more of that stem feeding and how they respond to those windy conditions. So as a farmer or agronomist, what you want is your canola to get to the 3 to 4 leaf stage as quickly as possible after you seed. Once you get 3 to 4 true leaves, your plants are a bit more resistant, and except in extreme cases, the flea beetle shouldn't be doing economic damage. So that's the challenge, getting to that 3 to 4 leaf stage quickly. If you are seeding into warm soil and you have good soil moisture, you might be able to make it and not have to do any foliar spraying. But if it sits in that seedling stage too long, that's when you need to be doing some scouting and potentially foliar spraying. But before the foliar spraying, we want you out there scouting and actually looking at what the percent defoliation is to your plants. So the next 3 slides are going to be a bit of a quiz to help you assess defoliation to cotyledons. So the first one I've got up here, have a look at that. See if you think that's a bad scenario, whether that looks like it could be economical. The threshold we use is 25% defoliation in the cotyledon stage. Now that you've had a look at that, that is roughly 10% defoliation that you're seeing right now. So if on average your cotyledons look like this, you're not in terrible shape. There's been some feeding, but if this is as bad as it gets, the plants will do just fine. So 10%, not a real threat to your crop. So now we're getting a little bit more feeding to the cotyledons. So have a look at this one. See what you think this one is, percentage-wise. And be careful, because sometimes our eyes are drawn to what's damaged, not what's there. It's really easy to overrate. So this is 25%. This is borderline economic threshold. If on average your cotyledons are looking like this and flea beetles are quite active on the plants and it appears the seed treatment is no longer working, this is where we recommend a spray is likely to be economical for you. So that's what 25% looks like. That's your economic threshold. And here's another one, beaten up a bit more yet. This is 50% defoliation. Some big chunks here that have turned brown. So as far as seed treatments go, again, you usually can get about 3 weeks out of them, sometimes maybe more, but it does depend on environmental conditions as well. All of the seed will be treated with a neonicotinoid, something like a Helix or a Prosper. Some plants might have Lumiderm or Fortenza Advance, which might give you a little bit extra time. But regardless, those neonics, they're more effective in dry soils than in wet conditions, and they're more effective at the warmer temperatures than at cooler temperatures. So right now it has been fairly dry in some areas and fairly mild, so those seed treatments should be working fairly effectively. But again, be careful, because after about 3 weeks after seeding, you will notice that they are starting to wear out. So we'll switch gear to grasshoppers. We were actually out yesterday looking in some of the ditches around Carmen, and the grasshopper eggs are hatching. We were finding mainly first instar nymphs. We think we did find a second instar. There was one that was a bit bigger, but most of them are quite small. The hatch is in the very early stages right now. Now, if you were poking around in the soil, you may notice grasshopper egg clusters. Grasshoppers lay their eggs in what we call pods. An individual grasshopper egg looks like a grain of brown rice, but there's usually about 20 or 30, or sometimes more, stuck together in what we call an egg pod. So that's what they look like on the upper right in your screen. When they first hatch out, they're very tiny. So on the lower right on the screen is a first instar nymph. So to put it into perspective, it's about the size of a wheat kernel. So very tiny when they first hatch out. They progressively get bigger and bigger as they grow. Now, if you do notice there's a lot of them in a field edge or a ditch area, and you're wondering when's the ideal time to be controlling them, once they start getting wing buds, then the hatch should be mainly done. If mostly what you're seeing is first instars, like we're seeing right now, there's a lot of hatch yet to go. So if you were to put an insecticide down now, there's still a lot of hatch happening. You run the risk of maybe having to redo things. Once they get into that stage where there's wing buds, hatch should be done, or at least wrapping up. And usually the grasshoppers are still quite concentrated. When they just have wing buds, they can't fly yet. So they're just hopping around, probably haven't moved too far. And again, that's usually the more ideal stage to be treating grasshoppers. So it'd be a bit early to be treating right now. Now, there can be exceptions if you've got grasshoppers hatching out into a crop, and the numbers are such that you are seeing a lot of damage. You do have to make a decision based on that. But generally, spraying in the bud stage, the wing bud stage, is what we're aiming for. Now, every August, we do a grasshopper survey, and we try to forecast what the next season might be like. Now, a lot of what will happen depends on weather conditions. Grasshoppers seem to thrive and do better under warmer, drier conditions. Last year, our map did have a fair amount of yellow and orange to it. So the way the map works, green is lighter risk, yellow is a bit higher, orange getting to be a bit more severe, and luckily we don't have any red on the map. That's the most severe category. But what I like to do is compare maps over a 4 or 5 year period and see what the trends are. When we look at that, we'll see that back in 2016 when we did the survey, and this would have been 2015 survey actually for the 2016 forecast, populations were quite low, and they were low right until about 2018. And when we did the survey in 2018 for our 2019 forecast, we noticed the populations climbing. They've been climbing for 2 or 3 years now, actually. So we're on an upward trend. And if we get another hot, dry year, that trend could keep continuing. So timely rains could knock the population back. A moist, humid stretch over the summer could get a fungal pathogen going in the population, take them down. But if we don't get those conditions, if it stays hot and dry throughout the summer, keep grasshoppers on your radar and make sure you're doing scouting, especially along the field edges as we go along. Now, when you're doing your scouting, especially early on in the season, just make note that grasshoppers aren't the only things that will be hopping in your ditches. Now, when we were out yesterday, we did find a few other insects that hopped. And on my slide here, I've got two insects. One of them is a grasshopper, one isn't. We'll see if you can figure out what the other one is. So the one on your left is a juvenile grasshopper. The one on the right is a leafhopper. And especially in the ditch areas, there's often a lot of leafhoppers, lots of different species of leafhoppers. We've got a few hundred species in Manitoba. There's only two species that we worry about as far as crop pests for leafhoppers, aster leafhopper and potato leafhopper. The rest are all non-pest species. And I guess the good news, when we were out doing our sweeping in the ditches yesterday in the Carmen area, we didn't find any aster leafhoppers or any potato leafhoppers. They were all non-pest species. But they do hop, and they are a little different than grasshoppers, but I guess maybe a grasshopper-like enough, and they hop around, that it's good to have a close look at what you're seeing. Don't confuse leafhoppers for grasshoppers. And as far as what eats grasshoppers and grasshopper eggs, there are a few predators. There's a lot of things that like the eggs. Bee flies, blister beetles, some species of blister beetles, field crickets. They will all eat or lay their eggs near grasshopper eggs. In case of bee flies and blister beetles, it's their larvae that consume them. So they will help out, but again, be on top of things. We could be in for some higher populations this year, regardless of the natural enemies. And again, this is the fungus I was talking about earlier. Here's a dead grasshopper clinging to a canola pod. This was taken late in the season a few years ago. We usually need some moist conditions to really get this fungus going. So if you see a lot of dead grasshoppers clinging to plants, that's good. That means they've got the fungus. So two more things before I wrap up. Just want to do a quick summary of what we're seeing in our diamondback moth traps. So every year we put up a series of traps, and we have them in the field for a 6-week period, and we monitor them and try to predict what the populations might be like. Right now we've got 84 traps up, and we encourage people, don't use these numbers to make spray decisions. These counts are meant to be used to get you out scouting, especially in the areas with higher trap counts. And as of yesterday, these were the highest trap counts in Manitoba. The Southwest, our highest trap count right now is Brookdale at 7. So that's after about 4 weeks of counting. So as far as we know, we haven't had any big populations blow into the Southwest. Northwest, the populations are fairly low as well. Our high count right now is in the Southern Interlake. Warren has 78 in the trap. Now, all of these occurred during mid-May. So the middle 2 weeks in May, they had 30 and 48 in their trap to give them their 78. Last week, the count was 0 in Warren. So what happened was a population likely blew in, got dumped in the area. We saw the adults for 2 weeks, but then last week they couldn't pick them up in the trap at all. So what has likely happened there is the adults that blew in, they would have been flying around, mating, laying eggs. They've died off, and we're going to wait and see how big that larval population is. 78 is not an alarming number. We did have some cool evenings in that period, so it's really hard to say what the larval population will be like. But Southern Interlake right now seems to be the hot spot. Bit of a outlier in the Gladstone area. One trap had 51. But overall, the counts aren't alarming. But again, just keep an eye on things, especially in that southern interlake. And one last thing I wanted to cover is pea leaf weevil. So pea leaf weevil, until last year, as far as we knew, we didn't have it in Manitoba. But an agronomist up in the Swan River area sent me a sample in September, and they were definitely pea leaf weevils. So we know that they are occurring in that area. This year we have about 20 pitfall traps up across, in fact, there's probably about 25 traps up across the northwest and southwest, trying to find these adult weevils and determine just how extensive the population is and where they're distributed. Now, what the weevils do is the adults just feed on the young leaves and make these little notches in the sides of the leaves. Not a big deal. The plants recover from this, so this isn't economical by any means. But the larvae, they feed on the nodules growing on the legume roots. So this is something that feeds on field peas and faba beans. The larvae aren't really feeding on the roots, they're feeding on the nodules. The nodules are providing the microbes that fix nitrogen. So when those nodules are eaten off, you can have basically nitrogen deficiency in those plants. So that's why pea leaf weevil is of concern. And again, we're trying to track where it is and what the populations are like. So there's the pheromone traps out. If you think you are seeing pea leaf weevil and you can grab a sample, get some, send them to me. Again, we're trying to track where this is and what the population's like. So just to summarize, flea beetles and cutworms, they're things that are currently very active. You should be scouting for those right now. Grasshopper levels, they've been increasing for the past few years. They're just starting to hatch out, so over the next week or two, it's going to be critical. Get out there, scout those ditches. And as far as what happens, we have to wait and see what the weather does, especially with the grasshoppers. Some good heavy rains right now would be timely. Grasshoppers can survive heavy rains well in the egg stage, but not so well when they're in the early juvenile stages. So some heavy pounding rains right now, even though it might not be good in some regards, would potentially knock that grasshopper population back. If you've ever wondered whether ants can get COVID-19, this will answer your question. They have antibodies, so no, they can't. And we'll wrap it up with that. I'll turn it over to Lionel again. And then...
Hey, thanks, John. Got a couple questions for you. Canola that was seeded and is up in just lately and is up in 5 to 6 days, but still seeing a lot of flea beetle feeding on the leaves. If it gets above the 25%, should you be looking at spraying?
Okay, so the first part of that, the canola has just emerged, has it?
Yes, yeah. It's been basically it's been up for 4 days, 5 days.
Okay, now I guess the critical thing is when it was seeded, seeding date, because when we talk about the seed treatments giving you roughly 3 weeks of protection, that's from the date of seeding, not the date of emergence. So depending on the seeding date,
was only in the ground for about 10 days in total now.
Okay, so it's possible the seed treatment probably should still be working, but it might be getting close to the end of its effective period. I would keep an eye on it. If it appears that the flea beetles are quite active on the plants, not getting killed, and you're up around that 25%, then yes, you would want to look at doing a foliar spray. Now, the flea beetles do have to take a bite or two and ingest the chemical before they become sluggish, stop feeding, and die. So sometimes you still do see some flea beetles a bit more active, even in a field where the seed treatment is working, but some of the flea beetles at least should be looking quite sluggish or dying.
Okay. So will the dingy cutworm climb the plant, or will it just feed as it's emerging?
Dingy cutworm, it belongs to a grouping of cutworms we call climbing cutworms. So the short answer is yes, they will climb. all cutworms in that category do. So as the plants get bigger, they will actually climb up onto some of the leaves and feed. They're not just feeding at ground level. Redback cutworms are a bit different. They do prefer to feed more ground level, and that's why instead of climbing, they'll just cut the plant.
Okay, and the last one, what's the difference between grasshoppers and locusts?
Oh, that's a really good question. So locust refers to a group of species of grasshoppers that when their populations get too dense and they're actually making contact with each other, they change physically and even chemically. What happens is a chemical, serotonin, builds up in their body. Two are similar chemicals, and behaviorally they change. They form this pack mentality where they move in a group, and even physically they change appearance. So the desert locusts in Africa, they will change color from kind of almost a brownish color to more of a yellowish color, depending on the species, when they go from that solitary stage to their gregarious stage. We don't have any true locusts in Canada currently. We had one species long ago that actually went extinct. It's the only agricultural pest to go extinct. It was called the Rocky Mountain locust. So right now we have grasshoppers. We don't have locusts in Manitoba.
Okay, thanks, John. Good presentation. And Lori, if you'll turn the screen over to me, we'll get into our panel discussion. Okay, I'd like to welcome our crop scouting panel, and there's the email addresses for Lori and myself if you have questions that you want to send in during the week so we can get on them for the following week. So I'm going to just jump right into it and go into our first question. And this is a question that we're starting to get quite a bit, especially in the western side of the province here, and especially when you go a little bit north. I think it's going to be for Dennis Lang, and it's, at what point do I need to reconsider seeding soybeans?
Well, I guess the first thing you really need to look at is the area that you're in. If you're in Western Manitoba and you're in zone soybean area 2 or soybean area 3, you're already into the extended deadline for crop insurance. June 4th is kind of the date, and we're sitting at June 3rd. To me, the next day or so is critical. Once you pass that, then I think you're going to be switching to other crops. We are a bit of a later start this year as far as the way the crop is emerging. So I think if you got it in the next couple of days, you should be fine. But again, if you pick the right variety and you've chosen an early season variety, you should be fine. If you decided last winter that you wanted to pick a little longer season variety, and you're still planting today, then in that situation, I would reconsider and maybe go to another crop.
Okay, thanks, Dennis.
You've got mail.
Okay, this is going to be again a question for. I'm going to start off with Dane, and then I'm going to get Dennis and maybe to chime in as well. But I think the biggest question right now, several questions coming in regarding frost damage from the past week here. And Dane, if you're there, would you start off? I think we're going to turn the screen over to you. You got a couple pictures for us.
Yes, I do. Thanks, Lionel. All right. As we heard from John, we did have some colder temperatures this past week. Right now, this is the map based on the frost conditions on Friday, May 30th, taken from 1 a.m. to 9 a.m. It doesn't indicate the duration of a cold snap or a frost on this map, but it does give you the lower boundary temperatures. Kenton and Neepawa in the western side of the province both had frost below -2 for up to 7 hours, and broad stretches of the Interlake and eastern regions also experienced those colder temperatures. So what do we do when faced with that? How do we come back with a canola crop particularly. So when to assess the damage. That frost happened on Friday, so all of Saturday we should have been out in the fields checking those hilltops, valleys, flat spots, and comparing areas with more or less trash cover. The more exposed areas can cool quicker and warm up quicker, but that trash acts as an insulating layer. So if it gets really cold, it'll stay cold in that trash for a longer period of time. It doesn't actually keep it warmer, against regular thinking, I guess. 72 hours later, so up to 3 days, reassess those areas for damage. So you're looking for your injured spots versus your non-injured spots. 3 to 5 days later is when that decision needs to be made. Do those plant stand counts look satisfactory, or have we lost a lot of that growing point? Is that new tissue damaged, or is there green tissue coming up? That reseed decision only can be made accurately between 3 and 5 days, depending on weather conditions. So what you do want to do is dig the plants out of the ground, make sure that the stem is not pinched off and girdled. The seedling is not floppy. Those floppy cotyledons, those floppy leaves are indicative of frost damage. Do check out your plant stems. We want a minimum of 4 plants per square foot to achieve optimal yield. Ideally, when we're seeding, we try and target between 5 to 7. 4 is the absolute minimum. We don't want to assume the plant is dead, because with warm conditions as we had, it froze and immediately warmed it back up again. Those are good growing conditions, and that crop could easily put on a new leaf. So don't just assume the crops are right from the get-go. Even when leaves are black, dried out, that growing point could resume growth a few days later. There's a note here: with herbicide-tolerant canola, we can get away with as few as 1 to 2 plants per square foot if the field is uniform, and uniform like at that density, as well as all other pests and damaging factors controlled. So we really need to watch flea beetle populations. We really need to watch weed populations and eliminate all other sources of competition, so that crop can actually achieve what's left of its potential at that density. When we're looking in our canola crops, we're looking for dull green leaves. So if it's dark, water soaked, or even pale. So right here, if we zoom in a little closer, you can see the cotyledons on these plants are pale. They're not nearly as vibrant green as the first new leaf growth happening here. So this regrowth is starting to occur, and that first main leaf is in fact healthy. Same with the rest of the plants. Here we have that pale soaked lesion is with that necrotic tissue starting to develop as it's dying and drying down. So we're looking for those water-soaked floppy cotyledons. That's immediately after that frost event. So right now we are 4 or 5 days out. We should be looking more for these symptoms, where we're going to have cotyledons that are probably completely dead, but are we going to get a green growing point right here? And is our stem girdled? So it's a little bit pinched off here. This particular plant won't make it. However, we got some green tissue here. It looks like it's putting on some new regrowth. That plant, if the density is appropriate, would likely survive. Now, to make a reseed decision, it's easier when your entire field is affected and you have no indication of life. You do need to consider what percentage is affected. Perhaps you just need to reseed a portion of the field, what the flea beetle pressure is like. If there is significant flea beetle feeding coupled together with a frost, that's certainly going to hamper the crop's ability to recover, and more seed in the ground is certainly going to help you out in this scenario. Your soil characteristics: is it lumpy? Is it dry? Do you have moisture to seed into? What's the forecast like? Costs of reseeding and the time it takes to do that, and is your crop insurance benefit coverage worth it, and what is your scenario like there? So make a yes decision to reseed. That current stand should be terminated, so you get a more uniform population. We know this is often not the case, simply because farmers are looking to have as high a density as a crop as they can in order to push yield later into the season. But uniformity is generally the key. Glyphosate and bromoxynil will kill all the canola. That bromoxynil, that group 6, will take out all those different herbicide types. Do watch your calendar date. We are past June 1st, so that early canola, or the first crop insurance deadline for canola seeding, is coming up quickly. I believe it's June 10th. do keep the seeding rates up. Just because we're seeding later doesn't mean it's the opportunity to skimp on seed. Do keep those numbers still around that 5 pound an acre mark, or 5 to 7 plants. No more nitrogen, but use that phosphate if conditions are, if seed is struggling and it might need that boost to get out of the ground. John talked about flea beetle action threshold, so I'm not going to talk about that too much, but do watch your weed control windows. If you have a frosted out field, when can you get back in with those herbicides? With Liberty, it's when that first new leaf has started development. Glyphosate tolerant canola is that we have the full development of a new leaf, so that first new leaf after frost needs to be fully emerged. Same thing with Clearfield herbicides. So some little guys here that were certainly frosted out, but we're getting some nice regrowth on that first new leaf. If your seed was in the ground germinated, under the soil should be okay, but there are other issues, crusting, things like that. Your seed treatment's wearing off, like John mentioned. It is exhausting the nutrient stores that seed has, and if it's growing slowly in those cold soils, the mortality rate is going to be higher. Right now, soils across Manitoba are generally 14 degrees Celsius and above, so we're in those nice warm soils right now. And that's all I have.
Okay, Lori, if you could pass the screen back to me. Okay, I'm going to get Dennis maybe to comment on soybeans.
So, yeah, so what you're seeing here is this was a seedling, soybean seedling from a number of years back where there was some mimicked frost damage on it. You can see here that the terminal growing point is gone, and that the plant itself, though, has started to regrow. This is about 7 to 10 days after the frost event. Soybeans do have 3 main growing points. They have their terminal bud, which in this case is damaged, and they have their terminal buds, which you can see coming out from cotyledons. Typically, the plants will regrow. As Dane said, you know, if the plant is limp and wobbly, chances are that plant's frozen hard enough that it's damaged below the cotyledons, and that will not recover. A couple things to keep in mind, and I'm beginning a few calls on this with growers trying to evaluate stands this year. If you do your stand counts and you're 80,000 plants and the crop's been in, let's say 2 weeks, that would be okay. I wouldn't do anything about that, because typically you're going to get more plants coming. If you're below that threshold, that's where it becomes a bit of an issue with you know, having enough plants there. One of the other keys to kind of keep in mind with this is that 80,000 plants will also take a little bit of care through the growing season to manage. So you have to be on top of your weed control. So in a herbicide tolerant system, you're going to be spraying multiple times to keep the weeds at bay. But overall, in my experience, I've seen stands of 80,000 plants produce yields of, you know, anywhere from 30 to 35 bushels an acre. Again, depending on the type of growing season that we have. In some cases, I've even seen as low as 60,000 plants still come through quite well. This was mainly due to seeding issues, but overall the yields were very strong. Again, that was in the south. If you're in the west, similar things should hold true. But if you're well below that 80,000, then that's when a reseeding of another crop might be an option.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. And any comments on the cereal crops that might have been touched?
So for spring cereals, like wheat, oats, barley, they're very tolerant to low temperatures. So I don't think that any of the regions of Manitoba reached a temperature low enough to affect spring cereals. Same with corn, V5 stage or less, the growing point is still underground for corn, so we wouldn't see any effect. The concern for cereals would be fall rye, I think would be the biggest concern. Since, you know, fall rye throughout parts of Manitoba is at the heading stage, and at that point it is sensitive to frost and can only withstand about -1 for a few hours. So if you do have fall rye that is heading, the injury symptoms would mostly be floret sterility. So, you know, it would be worth, you know, opening those heads up and making sure that the anthers inside are like the bright green to yellow color, and that they haven't turned white or brown. If they're, not that bright yellow green color, then we would expect that there could have been some damage to the anthers.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Next question. This one will go to John and Tammy, I'm pretty sure. I was out in the field the other day with a producer, and in places the crop had come up patchy, and in places some of you'd get a good row, and then there'd be 4 to 6 plants dying off. The producer put 400 pounds of 1152 down with a disc drill. The field was sprayed with glyphosate just as a few plants were starting to break the soil surface. So what was going on is it fertilizer or herbicide damage. So we did go out to the field to investigate, but I thought if we turn the screen over to John and I guess to Tammy, I guess she's got some photos, we can get the answer there.
Good. Thanks, Lionel, for setting us up for this. And Tammy and I thought it was best that we run through what some of those pointers are or hints in doing some of these field investigations to help pinpoint this. So I'm going to let Tammy's got some slides here of some of the pointers on differentiating this.
Well, let's hope that I have the right thing up. Do I? Or don't I?
Yes, looks good here.
Okay. So this is a separate case from the one that Lionel is talking about, but we'll use it as a starting point. So John, the gentleman in the red shirt, hiding in the corner of the left-hand picture, and I went out and looked at this field, and I think that the first thing that we both noticed is how amazingly straight the lines are as far as defining this patch. In both of these pictures, you can see that this is likely a man-made problem because of an equipment or an application type of a scenario rather than soil or crop emergence being variable or that sort of thing. So that was my first clue. John, do you have anything that you want to add about these particular pictures?
No, that you were just very complimentary calling me a gentleman.
Well, just this one time. Okay, so then we did a little bit of digging, and certainly one of the things that we look at is the root and the shoot. And when we dug up a healthy plant, we could find normal roots for the most part. If we looked at the top roots, we could still see that there was some indication of maybe some injury. For me, that would suspect herbicide, but on the really badly injured plants, almost no roots whatsoever, and maybe a little bit of browning on the coleoptile as well, and then quite a range of underground emergence or death and that sort of thing. So for me, I do suspect herbicide here, but John, I think you think that there's sometimes opportunities where fertilizer might do the same sort of damage.
Yes, I have some photos that I might add here or later in our crop pest report showing almost identical type of symptoms. Plants with poor roots or no roots and yellow and leafing out below ground that we've identified as fertilizer injury. So the field visit is really critical here. Pictures sometimes don't do it.
And so we had some pictures like this sent in to us, and that's why we were debating or sort of arm wrestling over which one it could be. And then for me, this was the picture that helped me to seal the deal, I would suspect. So in the healthy wheat growing areas, an abundance, a plethora even, of weeds. And in the area where you can see the poorly growing wheat, you can also see a complete absence of weeds, especially the ones that would be expected to be controlled by this particular herbicide if it was in a carryover kind of scenario. So the red root pigweed and the lamb's quarter is well controlled in the injured area. So for me, that seals it that this one is likely herbicide carryover, but John, you had other scenarios where it turned out differently.
Mm-hmm. And yes, and I don't know, Lori, if you can switch to my slides there. I don't think I prepared you for this. But I've been out to some calls that have been surprising us. We've been seeing some seed-placed fertilizer injury in cases that don't have all the do not have all the risk factors. I just want to show this slide. I was delighted. This grower actually has what we had referred to as a check stamp, or a small area of the field without the seed placed fertilizer in it. And you can see it doesn't look very good now. It's light green because it doesn't have the fertility, but it has a full stand. And that's what you would compare to. And as we would look at that and compare, well, where's the stand not quite so good? I don't care very much about the plants that are looking good. I want to know about the losers, the ones that I can't find. And their digging showed that these plants were trying to develop. There was quite a bit of dissolved fertilizer, really intimate in that seed row. And when we look at the other points, is that we do have some survivors, but those survivors are curtailed or delayed in emergence because of the fertilizer in that zone. What was surprising, these are usually our soils that are almost bulletproof, some heavier clay soils, and that was surprising. The rates of fertilizer were not high that had caused problems in the past. But one of the things that we were seeing, and I think, Lionel, you pointed out to us on your field, is that these were disc drills into some wet soil, and we did see sidewall smearing, and wondering if that tight placement of fertilizer with the seed, the sidewall smearing that went on in wet conditions, followed by dry weather, maybe we just were not getting roots or fertilizer diffusing out of that tight little zone. Nevertheless, in these cases, the stand was still satisfactory for a full stand, for good yield potential. So most of these are being left and looked after accordingly.
Just to add in here, John, to go back to the original question, which was 4 to 5 plants dying and some that aren't. In addition to it being sidewall smearing sometimes, and those types of scenarios, the fertilizer being inadvertently put too close to a seed in certain planting or seeding scenarios, having that furrow open and those emerging cotyledons or those emerging plants exposed to a herbicide could result in some sort of death similar to the fertilizer. So again, it doesn't automatically mean that it's one or the other. We do need to look at a lot of things. And so when we talk about, say, a late application of glyphosate and maybe it only hurt a few, or there was only 1 or 2 plants emerged, sometimes we underestimate how many plants might be emerged when we're trying to squeak in that pre-seed burn. And if we have that furrow open, we might actually be exposing more plants than what we intended. And so that investigation needs to dig a little deeper.
And Lionel, I'll just mention that I think both Tammy and I will be supplementing the crop pest report with a bit more detail on these stories. So that's it for me now.
Okay, thanks, John. Lori, if I can get you to return my screen. Okay, and I think I put in one more slide here, and this was, if you look, this is the seed row, and we actually cleaned it out. There was, and you could see that sidewall that John was talking about in his comments about that sidewall smearing. A lot of the seed was embedded in that wall there and really had a hard time for the roots to escape that area. So they were in that area for a while, picking up whatever fertilizer was there. So. Okay, the next question would probably go to Marla. We've been seeing some issues with poor crop emergence from soil crusting, both in tilled and zero-till fields. Maybe if she can comment on what's the cause of, or what could be the cause of this, and what could be done to maybe make it a little bit better for the germination.
Yeah, okay, so We're hearing a bit of this issue. I'm glad you showed the sidewall compaction too, because that's also been affecting emergence. But where we're seeing these soils that have that crusting, where we see the most, I guess the biggest risk factors are generally where we have soils with a bit of weaker structure or soils that have fine texture. So clay soils, we seeded wet this year, and that's the problem. So when we were putting this into wet soil, that surface has a higher chance to get crusted over. So we seeded wet, and then we had some very hot drying weather, which caused that crusting. It's the big effect potentially on some fields if it's quite bad crusting in terms of crop emergence, just because the crop just doesn't have the ability to push through that crust. And we also have an influence of water infiltration. So then any further rain on top of that crust can't actually move down through that soil profile, and it'll sit and pond on the surface. So that's even a bigger problem when we're dealing with those clay soils or soils that don't have good structure at the surface, that we start decreasing that ability for water to move in. In terms of solutions, short-term solutions is basically either wait for some rain, getting significant enough rain that actually could soften the crust to allow the crop to emerge. But again, that's not something we have control over. In some areas, you'll use a rotary hoe to go in and break that up. The problem is you can also further damage the crop. And this isn't something that's feasible for crop growers, although we do see in horticulture crops, carrot growers have had significant problems with this in past years because those soils typically have lower organic matter from years of tillage, not a lot of residue left in those soils, and so they crust over easily. So therefore they use either their irrigation to soften the crust, or they'll actually kind of hoe it to break it up. So we can't control the weather. We can, however, control soil management. So this becomes a long-term management solution. Short-term, again, first, before I forget, if it's that bad, we may be looking to reseed, and hopefully we're not reseeding into those similar types of conditions because the soil has dried a little bit more. If we're talking about long-term solutions, what we really want to do is build that soil structure up. We want to leave residue because the residue is actually helping to protect the soil from that drying. So where we saw a significant amount of burning, that might have ended up putting the soil at a higher risk then in some cases. And we want to build organic matter over time because, again, the organic matter is what's helping to build that soil structure. The better structured the soil, the less risk we have in the long run for this type of crusting problem again.
Okay, thanks, Marla. And next question is going to go to Tammy, and this came from Crop Scout. You had a farmer that didn't spray anything as a pre-seed burn off in his wheat. He's got foxtail barley, dandelion-like weeds are bad now. And what is his suggestion to mix with velocity? He wants to use velocity to kill these weeds and in his wheat, he wants to use velocity. So what could he add to it to get these weeds?
Okay, so I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Sometimes we get ourselves into a situation that we just can't get ourselves out of, and there is no magic cocktail that's going to fix it. I understand conditions might not have been favorable to do a pre-seed burn, but not a lot to work with in crop. The group 2s do suppress the foxtail barley a bit. So whether it's Everest or Vero or any of those types of group 2 products, they will have some suppression on the foxtail barley, but it won't be a control scenario. Velocity itself on dandelion is only suppression as well. And if they're well established, which is what it will be like, then the suppression will be less. So it's not an answer for either of the weeds, but it's as adequate as any option, I suppose, if he's intending on using Vero for whatever reason. Personally, I would look at the weeds and select the chemical, not select the chemical and then try to fit the weeds to it. When it comes to velocity, if you look on the label or in the guide, the only options for tank mix partners, 2,4-D is a registered or labeled tank mix, and then supported would be Lawntrell or MCPA. Those might help out with the dandelions a little bit, but nothing will help out with the foxtail barley. So hope for good crop competition and do everything to enhance the efficacy of the herbicide. Make sure you've got a good water volume, that you're spraying on a great day, that you are spraying it as soon as you can while the weeds are still as small as they can be, but it's a bad situation with no real solution.
Okay, thanks, Tammy. John, I put this one on because I see this on a yearly basis, and you answered that for us in your presentation. Do you just want to mention again what that white worm is?
Actually, I didn't cover this one. There's different types of, I'll call them white worms, that are out there. One I showed earlier was the potworms or enchiched worms, which were totally white. You couldn't see the segmentation as well, and there was absolutely no indication of a head on the enchiched. This one's got a bit of a head capsule to it, and behaviorally, if you were to poke at this worm, it would squirm like nuts. It would go snaky. This is called a therivid larva. The adults of therivids are called stiletto flies. They're medium-sized, quite hairy flies. They almost look gray. They're so hairy as flies. But yeah, these larvae are strictly predaceous, very quick. Now, these are bigger cutworms. They may prey on these. Definitely smaller cutworms would be good prey items. Wireworms, we know they prey on wireworms, even earthworms. So that's called a therivid larva or stiletto fly larva, and they're strictly predaceous. Those are good guys. Don't confuse them with wireworms.
Okay, good, thanks. Glad I brought that slide up. I think that's all the questions we have for today. So I'm going to quickly go through the last few slides here, a few reminders of what's available and where to find stuff. So again, the crop protection guidebooks are still available at most offices. The reports that John Hurd talked about and John Gabloski and the rest of the guys put together on insects and crop growing conditions are all on our website, so definitely go there for more information. The production and extension specialists in the province are listed here, and so if you got questions, definitely contact these people and they can help you find out some of the issues that are going on out there. And for your credits, there's Lori's email address again, and join us next week, June the 10th, for the next edition of Crop Talk. Thanks for attending.